if you're camera shy or whatever, if you should be at work or whatever, then turn off your video. Michelle, are you good to go with the record button? Where's it going?
Yes,
Okay.
So it should be going.
Cool. Well, so welcome everyone for coming along this morning. Just a quick introduction from me. We've seen across the Rivers Trust movement a lot more use of continuous monitoring devices, SONs and sensors, and particularly we're starting to see low-cost sensors emerging as well now, which means we're going to be having a lot more high volumes of data collected. This got us thinking a year or so ago about how we might best make the best of that data. It can very quickly become overwhelming for humans to kind of wade through that data in terms of spreadsheets and things. So we started looking into opportunities to investigate kind of machine learning approaches, and that led us to a funding call, or a call by the Alan Turing Institute, where we submitted a proposal to them, and they supported us and gave us some funding to bring on an internship for 6 months. So Andrew joined us, and he's coming towards the end of that 6 months now. So we're really keen to kind of explore these techniques and make more of them. And obviously it has particular relevance for the CaSTCo project, looking at integrating different data sets and different data types. So really, as we get to the end of the internship, we've got a data camp, a data study group planned for a week or so's time, where we're going to get a load of machine learning students, I guess, together, or practitioners to look at a problem that we've devised. But in the meantime, we just thought it'd be a nice way to kind of bookmark, some of Andrew's time by presenting some of the stuff he's found and some introductory information on machine learning. So I'll pass over to Andrew now, and see you later. Oh, if there's any questions, pop them in the chat, and we'll tackle them at the end. Thank you.
Hey, thanks, Simon. So I'm Andrew. I am the current Alan Turing Institute intern with the Rivers Trust, and I've been here for 7 months now. I'm normally a final year data science and ecology PhD student at the University of Leeds, and I'm heading back to that on the 1st of April. So yeah, I've been asked basically to do a quite quick overview, a very introduction as to what is machine learning and how can it help CaSTCo. So I'm going to start by just going a little bit into the basics of machine learning and some basic concepts, and then I'm going to start going through different examples of techniques or problems you might want to solve in the CaSTCo project using machine learning. Now, when most people my slide is not changing. There we go. Sorry. When most people think of machine learning, they tend to think of things like these examples here. One that has been in the news a lot recently is ChatGPT, a device where you can type in a question and it will come up with an incredibly relevant answer, quite well written. You also get some more historical and famous examples are the AlphaGo project. This was an artificial intelligence software that could basically beat any human player at the board game Go, which is considered much more difficult for AI than the game of chess because the rules are a lot less clear. There's a lot more different decisions that you need to make. Another famous one is sort of the Google DeepMind project, which they do a bit of everything. They do a lot of sort of photo recognition. Can we pick out different things in photographs and put them together? Now, what machine learning actually is very, very simple. And what I'm hoping to do is show that actually what these techniques are very, very simple things, just done quite complexly. So I'm just going to run through a little bit of the jargon first, so that we're all on the same page. So some of the definitions that you might have come across, some of the words and terms you might have heard when you talk about machine learning. So the first one, the overarching concept, is this idea of artificial intelligence. Now, all this is the science of basically making computers do tasks that usually would require human intelligence. Things like walking, performing calculations, sort of stuff like that. Now, within artificial intelligence, there's this subset called machine learning. And what this is basically giving computers the ability to learn. We present them with data or problems, and we give them coding or a mechanism through which to learn that task, learn that relationship. Deep learning, which is spoken about a lot at the minute, is a very specific subset of machine learning, where basically they're just using very specific and advanced algorithms called artificial neural nets that learn problems in a similar way to how the human brain will learn a problem. A couple of other things that I'm probably going to be talking about is labeled data and unlabeled data. All labeled data is data where your target for learning, what you want the machine, the computer to be able to learn, has been clearly defined. And also, I'll probably mention ground truthing. And all this is data that is real or true, that has come from reality and hasn't actually been predicted, inferred, or simulated in any way. Now, I'm probably not really going to talk about deep learning or artificial intelligence much again. For the CaSTCo project, they're not really like they're probably not really too essential. So just going a little bit deeper into machine learning specifically. But as we've just said, it is a type of artificial intelligence where a computer can learn from experience or data. Specifically, a computer is learning a relationship, or it's learning to make a prediction, or it's learning to take an action. Now, how this happens is we don't just ask the computer to do something, but we have coded a specific algorithm, a model that the computer can use iteratively to learn that task, to do that action. Now, the tasks that we give the computer are often things like, can we learn a relationship from data? Say, for example, can we predict the value of a property based on the area of the property? Or can we make a prediction into the future, or sort of an inference like that, sort of a forecasting model based on historical relationships? Or so can we find underlying patterns of structure in data? Now, the advantage of machine learning is that computers are much better at taking huge data sets together and finding patterns in them. The human brain is more powerful than a computer, but is quite general. It's not very good at these specific and intense tasks. There are a few common themes that you will come across in machine learning. First, what is the model learning from? Have you given it a pre-existing data set? Is that data set labeled or unlabeled, or have any sort of structure in it? Like, is it time series data? Is it an Excel spreadsheet? Is it a photo? Or, is it actually just learning because all we've given it is the mechanism to know whether it succeeded or not, and it makes its own data set? The next thing is, how is the model learning? Is it learning through sort of something like a gradient descent algorithm? Is it learning basically by fitting a straight line? Is it making a decision tree? All that sort of stuff. And there are basically multiple different algorithms and different models that we can give a computer to let it learn a relationship. Next is kind of the structure of the task. Are we asking it to predict a specific value? Are we asking it to learn to do a specific task, like event, like action? Or is it just looking for patterns and structure? Now, all machine learning basically boils down to these very simple ideas here. So overall, really, there are three main types of learning in machine learning. The first one is what we call supervised learning. Now, supervised learning is a task-driven model. We are setting the machine a specific thing we'd like it to do. We are either asking it to predict the value of one variable, of one thing, like the value of a house, or, if we're giving it human data, is it an adult or a child, for example? And we're asking it to learn that from some other data, from some other variables. So for the value of the house, from the area of the house, and maybe the number of bathrooms and stuff like that. And these are usually called regression problems if we're asking it to predict a sort of continuous value, or a classification problem if we're asking it to predict a discrete grouping. Now, to go back to the examples on the first page, ChatGPT is actually a supervised learning model, and it's a classification model. It's just predicting what word should come next in a sequence based on your query, And the data set it's trained from is basically the internet before 2021. It's a very sophisticated, nuanced, and structured classification model, but that is all it really is. Similarly, Google DeepMind image recognition is a specific type of classification problem. Next, we have unsupervised learning. Now, these are more sort of data-driven, data mining approaches. We're not giving the computer a specific thing we would like it to learn or predict. What we're doing is we're giving the computer just a data set. It could be structured data or unstructured, anything really. And we're just asking it to sort of look for patterns in that data, to reduce the complexity of that data, and to report back to us. And this is sort of like a clustering or ordination sort of problems. So one example that you use unsupervised learning for a lot is in freshwater, is if you've got sort of invertebrate composition data at multiple sites. And what you might do is you might ask the computer, look, I want you to group all of these different invertebrate sites into different groupings based on what species you have there. And the computer will go away and it might say, okay, you've got ones over here that are sort of very gamma ray dominated. You've got ones over here that are chironomid dominated. So I'm going to say that they are different groupings together. The third approach is called reinforcement learning. We do not really use reinforcement learning very often in the physical sciences. It's kind of more for, it's used a bit in engineering, it's used for sort of artificial intelligence. If ever you see like robots learning to walk, that's usually reinforcement learning. The AlphaGo model from the first slide, where it's learning to play a game, that is a reinforcement learning thing. Specifically with reinforcement learning, you usually don't give the computer a data set or anything to sort of learn from. You basically tell the machine what task it wants to do. You give it a definition for success and definition for failure, and then it goes away, it plays, it learns sequences of actions that allow it to do that. Now, I couldn't really think of a good infographic for reinforcement learning, so this is my dog, Leica. Now, in reinforcement learning, you often have, they use what's called an agent-based approach, where the computer is a specific agent. Now, in this example I've tenuously come up with here, my dog Leica could be considered an agent, and she is learning to play fetch. If the agent returns the ball, the agent will get a treat or a reward, and will become more likely to return the ball in future. You know, a lot of reinforcement training is similar to how we would train a dog or an animal. So just moving on to a different example, all machine learning really falls into one of these three categories. But within each category, for a specific task, there might be multiple ways to actually do that task, multiple different algorithms you can use. So just to go through a quick example here, say we want to estimate the value of a property from the area of that property. So going back to the previous slide, we can say that this is a task-based model. We are wanting the model to predict a specific continuous value based on another continuous value. So specifically, this is a supervised regression problem. Well, it's a supervised regression problem. Sorry, I skipped ahead there. Now, this is some dummy data that I've thrown together on the right here. As we can see, as the area of the property increases, so too roughly does the value. We can see that more or less there is a straight line relationship between the two. Now, there are a few different types of regression model that we could use. A data science practitioner will decide which type of model to use based on sort of what shape of relationship they might expect, what the structure of the data is, you know, is it time series, is it an image, is it truly independent, and also sort of how much data you have, how many variables you're wanting to consider at the same time. So for this example, there are a couple of different approaches that we could use. The first one is called the linear model. I guarantee most people who will have done any degree in sort of geography, biology, and did a statistics module will have probably used a linear model, maybe without realizing that it's actually machine learning. The linear model is the workhorse of the data science world. It is incredibly flexible, it is simple, powerful, and effective. And importantly, it's very easy to describe to people who don't understand machine learning. So what a linear model will do is it will first just fit a line in the relationship, just a random sort of line, and then it will calculate the distance between every known data point and the line it's predicting, and it will calculate that average error. Then it will sort of fit another line and do the same calculation, how much error is there, and it will compare the two using an algorithm we've given it called the gradient descent algorithm. Based on the difference between the two lines and the difference in error, it'll then use the algorithm to take another step in the right direction. The size of the step that it takes will be dependent on the difference in error between the two. And so it'll fit another line. Then it will do the same again, and it will keep going and going until it's got to the best relationship. What's really clever about a linear model too is that as the difference in error gets smaller, it will also take smaller and smaller steps until it gets to that single optimum relationship. And eventually it'll say something like this, overall, this is the average relationship. On average, as area increases by 10, I would expect the value of the property to increase by 10K, for example. Now, another model you could use would be what's called a decision tree. And this is exactly what it says on the tin. It basically fits a series of conditional statements to try and describe the relationship in the data. So first it might say, is the area of this property above 100 meters squared? If yes, assume that the property has a value of about £300,000. If no, it'll ask another question, so is the area less than 50? If the area is less than 50, it might say, assume it's 100,000, and if it isn't, assume it's 200. You can vary how many decisions the decision tree will take to sort of get a better fit to the relationship, and it'll keep going until it's kind of best described the relationship it can. Now, decision trees use something called the information gain algorithm, where basically it will look at all different decisions it could make, and the first decision it will make will be the one that gives it the most information. So the one that reduces variance in the data the most. Now, you can take these decision trees and you can fit them on a graph just like a linear model, and you'll get something that looks a little bit like this, where instead of having a straight line that you can explain with a single equation, you get a series of plateaus connected by these little jolts for each decision tree. Now, the advantage of a decision tree is that it can fit nonlinear data, they're quite flexible, it can sort of look at interactions and things like that. And the disadvantage is that actually it's harder to just describe that relationship to people, and it's harder to conceptualize that to people. So, depending on what you want to use the model for, if you just want to use it as a predictive model, you might go with something as like a decision tree. But if you want to sort of show it to stakeholders or interested parties, maybe you'd prefer to use something like a linear model. Both of these models are capable of performing, predictions on new data, where you might say, I've got a new property coming on the market, its area is about here, give me an estimate of what the value of that property should be. So there are hundreds upon hundreds of different types of algorithms with different advantages and limitations designed for different types of data, and navigating that can be quite difficult. Luckily, there are machine learning cheat sheets, hundreds of them on the internet, that can guide you through what sort of model you want, the different strengths and weaknesses of them, based on what task you want to do. This is just an example from that Microsoft Azure have put out. It's got a pretty good thing. It's got some of the regression and clustering stuff that you'd use for the physical sciences, but it's also got things that you might use for sort of image classification and recognition. It doesn't have anything on sort of spatially explicit machine learning or like time series machine learning that you might want to use for the natural sciences, but it's a good starting point, and other cheat sheets have more on that sort of stuff. We've got a link to a few at the end of this presentation if anyone wants to sort of have a look around. So that's just a very quick overview as to what machine learning is and how it can be used. In reality, machine learning is a lot more simple than most people initially think. And a lot of people don't actually realize that they've been using machine learning. So specifically today, let's talk about how can machine learning help the CaSTCo project. Now, the easiest way to do this is sort of to try and bring it back to what CaSTCo's overarching goals and objectives are. First, CaSTCo is looking at data collection and accessibility of data. It's about sort of developing novel technique, developing smart catchments, hybridizing multiple data sources with citizen science to sort of get high quality, high density, and reactive monitoring. There's a strong focus on can we empower local communities and citizen science with information? And also, can we sort of get real-time monitoring? So actual reactive and fast monitoring out into the world. So to go through, a couple of ideas for data collection. Real data is often quite messy. You'll get sensors that are breaking, you'll get things happening that you don't really expect. So machine learning can help by sort of developing tools that will automatically tidy data as it comes in, or if you've got a malfunctioning sensor, maybe you could reconstruct the data from the period where it's broken until it can get repaired. For empowering local communities, well, we could develop tools that can automatically detect and trace pollution events to the source and distinguish between different events. And they could trigger warnings that could be sent out to local swimming groups, for example, or trigger increased sampling rates from citizen scientists. On top of that, you can develop tools for event forecasting. So by bringing together different sorts of data, river quality data, meteorological data, can we actually predict maybe up to 2 weeks in advance when a bacterial bloom or a phytoplankton bloom might occur? To help with the real-time monitoring, CaSTCo will a lot of the demonstration catchments will be deploying sort of hybrid high and low cost sensor networks. And actually, there are a lot of different machine learning algorithms that can allow you to use these networks in a single model where it knows the spatial relationship and you can empower it. You can increase the amount of information you're getting from a low-cost sensor by using it in a network with other low-cost sensors. And the sort of the holy grail of real-time monitoring is this concept of digital twins, which are virtual representations of the real world, powered largely by real-time data coming in. Now, I'm just going to run through a few of these examples, and I'm going to try and tie them back to these basic concepts of machine learning and how you might build these models and deploy them in real time. So the first in this hierarchy is sort of, can we detect pollution events automatically? So in any given catchment, you might expect a range of different types of pollution event, from sewage overflow to sort of rainfall-driven agricultural pollution. Now, to tie it back into the sort of the types of learning, the hierarchy of machine learning, we can say that this is a task-driven model. We're wanting an algorithm that can learn to describe specific things. And pollution events are a sort of discrete category. It is one type of pollution event or another. So we would say that this is a supervised classification model. So if we want to develop a classification model for CaSTCo, how might we go about building that? What we would really need is historical labeled data from sensors or from the catchments you're looking at. Usually you need about 3 to 6 months worth of data with the different types of pollution events ideally labeled. What you could do then is train the model to distinguish between these different types of event, maybe from the water quality variables you're getting from the sensors, so things like conductivity, phosphate, temperature, and so on. Now, I've actually been looking at this as part of my internship using the Wensum DTC and the Eden DTC dataset. So that's 10 years worth of sensor data. And I was using something called a random forest, which is a supervised classification or regression technique. They're very, very flexible and robust. They're not sort of prone to overfitting. And what I found was that actually, yes, you can distinguish, some of the sensors I was looking at were picking up to 10 different types of pollution event, or 10 different types of pollution event that the algorithm considered distinct. And it was able to distinguish between them incredibly effectively. I then took it a bit of a step further and I was like, okay, well, how few variables does this model need to be able to distinguish between them? And we found that if you had the right combination of variables, which would vary depending on what sort of type of catchment you were in, you could get away with as few as 3 independent variables being monitored to distinguish between events. So say now, for example, say that we've built this model from historical water quality data. How might we implement that in real time? So we've got a real-time network coming in. We have some sort of threshold, some model that is sort of distinguishing between a normal event and an anomalous event. And it's detected that we have an anomalous sample that's come in. We then deploy this random forest on the data and we say, look, tell me what has happened here. And it will say, oh, I think that based on the values that we've seen here, I think that this was an agricultural driven runoff event, for example. That could be used to trigger the next bit of computing where it might send out an alert to citizen scientists to sort of increase the frequency of samples, or it might kick off a track and trace model of the specific type to work out where that's actually come from. The next thing we might want to kind of look at for CaSTCo is this idea of data reconstruction. So as we all know, SONs can be temperamental at best, particularly things like, phosphate or ammonia readers. They break all the time. They might get knocked out of the water. Some well-meaning person might come along and just sort of break them. So actually, could we reconstruct data from malfunctioning sensors so that we've actually not lost what we want to, with any information? So again, going back to that simple, the overarching types of learning, we can say that that is a task-driven model. And specifically, that's a supervised regression model. We're wanting to predict a specific value of variable based on the other variables measured at the same time. Now, to do that for data reconstruction, again, we will need historical water quality data from that site. So about 3 to 6 months worth of data, ideally more, but you can just get these things started quite easily. Now, what we would do is we would want that data to be labeled. So we've got the sort of normal data, and we know what that is. And we've got all the anomalous event, the broken sensor and pollution data off to one side. Ideally, you would actually train that data on the labeled normal data, including the pollution events. And you would say, I want you to predict the value of, for example, phosphate based on the other variables that you detected at the time. I had to look at this on some broken sensors as part of the internship, and we found that we could reconstruct phosphate data pretty accurately. Again, with as few as 3 to 4 different variables being recorded. Now, what might this look like in real time? The previous model, say, has flagged this anomalous data is a broken sensor. And specifically, we'll say it's the phosphate that is broken for this example. The next would be this random forest would get deployed, predicting what value of phosphate we should expect to see there based on the other variables we're measuring at the same time. And then it would also probably flag that data just saying, look, this data is not ground truth, it is inferred data. And it would send out an alert to the local team to be like, look, this sensor is broken, could we get it repaired, please? And that's just a way that we can try and improve the power of these sensors by accounting for their limitations with machine learning. Now, so far, we've looked at sort of just one source of data at a time, data coming in from individual sensors. A lot of the power of machine learning comes from when we start bringing different data sources together and layering them on top of each other. So one idea is, can remote sensing be used to empower CaSTCo? Probably, and the answer is probably yes. So say, for example, water quality. Can we detect water quality from remote sensing data? Remote sensing data is usually multi-band images of the Earth, or measuring other things remotely from the Earth. We can say that this is a task-driven model again, and whether it's a regression or a classification would depend on what variable of water quality we wanted to use. Say, for example, if you looked at something like the River Habitat Survey, that gives you a specific numeric value for each different river based on, bankside vegetation, fluvial morphology, and stuff like that. What you could do is overlay things like that onto remote sensing data, layer it on top of images that have been cut up into different little sizes, and then you would feed that into something like a convolutional neural network. These are sort of a hybrid. They can be shallow learning or they can be deep learning, and they're really, really powerful at learning relationships between between images and whatever variable you're wanting to detect. Now, this is a bit more of a complicated example, but what I want to highlight here is that actually machine learning is a lot more capable at learning relationships that the human brain struggles, and actually can perform really, really well at tasks that we wouldn't expect it to be able to. So by merging and combining data, that can allow us to answer more complicated questions in novel manners. I think the other point I wanted to make here too is that actually, we as the machine learning practitioners, we can ask any question of machine learning, but what we have to do is work out how do we represent the reality that we want to answer for the algorithm. In this example, yeah, we can ask a computer to try and work out river quality from remote sensing data, but how are we going to tell it what water quality is, on what scale, and how do we want it to look at that question? Now, the examples we've looked at before have been looking at building tools that could be deployed in real time. Machine learning can also be used to answer questions rather than having a continuous model going on. Now, as Simon mentioned, we've put together a data study group that we're running with the Alan Turing Institute and the University of Newcastle in 2 weeks. And we've managed to get together a bunch of different sensor networks from multiple sources, ranging from about 7 sensors deployed for 10 years up to about 50 sensors deployed for half a year. What we're going to ask the data study group to do is give us guidance on what is the optimum distribution of sensors in the freshwater environment. So the freshwater environment is incredibly unique. It's very, very structured. It's got into channels. It's got strong directionality associated with it. And it's also got these sort of interactions with the floodplain. Now, what this means is that you need very specific types of model that can account for this relationship when you want to sort of compare spatial interactions. Now, a prime candidate for this is something called a graph neural net. These are, again, a sort of shallow/deep learning technique that can account for the spatial relationship between different things in a network. Now, what we're going to ask the data study group to do is take these sensor networks and fit graph neural nets on them. And specifically, what we'd like them to do is see if they can predict the values at one sensor based on the values that were recorded at every other sensor, given that it knows the relationship and how they're connected. Then what we're going to do is we're going to start removing sensors at random, and we're going to compare the model performance. What you'd expect is that as fewer sensors are in the network, model performance should deteriorate. And this will, from each model, we're going to probably extract a bunch of different bits of information. What is the average distance between sensors? Were those sensors on a headwater, at a confluence of tributaries, or sort of mid-channel? And we're going to use that to feed other models so we can get this sort of idea of how few sensors do we actually need, how far should there be between sensors, and what are the impacts of like tributaries and impoundments, for example. This is going to be a really, really exciting project that I'm quite looking forward to. For one thing, graph neural nets are becoming increasingly deployed in freshwater, and I'm quite excited to see how they could work with sensor networks in the CaSTCo project. But on the other hand, this could have real-time ramifications on how the CaSTCo sensor networks get developed. I think what I want to demonstrate here is that actually, the previous examples are about building a real-time tool. This is a demonstration of actually how different machine learning techniques can be layered on top of each other to actually just give us an understanding of reality that we can then use to build new networks, to gain new information. Machine learning doesn't have to be about a tool that you're developing continuously. It can just be a sort of experimental thing. Now, the holy grail of sort of real-time environmental monitoring is this concept of the digital twin. So increasingly, digital twins are being produced. They're used quite extensively in engineering already. And a few companies in the UK are looking at developing environmental digital twins. So what a digital twin is it is simply a virtual representation of the real world environment, and it is built either through a simulation or using this concept called the Internet of Things. Now, you may have heard the term Internet of Things. All this is basically the idea that everything is connected to the internet these days and sending data somewhere. Your toaster, your fridge, your phone, your car. And importantly for the CaSTCo project, a lot of the meteorological data, the water sensors, are going to be transmitting data in real time over the internet. Now, the difference between a digital twin and just getting data sent into a spreadsheet is this thing called the digital pipeline. You know, a spreadsheet just sat somewhere isn't necessarily the most useful or accessible thing. To get from that to a representation, a simulation of reality, you can apply a series of different algorithms, of different equations that calculate new different parameters. And they can bring in multiple different data sets coming in real time. Now, what your digital pipeline will look like will vary depending on what you want your digital twin to do. You know, if you want your digital twin to just be a visualization, then you might just do things like you've got real-time sensor networks and you're interpolating values between them so that you can sort of see what values are where across the entire river network. And you've got a nice little graphic where it's red when it's high, it's green when it's low, or something like that. Or you might have a thing where, you know, you've detected pollution events at multiple sensors, so that'll go into the digital twin and it'll just draw sort of a red line along where the pollution event might be. Another use of it is this idea of creating an actual responsive simulation. So say you parameterize a lot of how you would expect reality to respond. Say, for example, you've got models that can explore the relationship between pollution events and the rate of flow. And then you could take that digital twin and query it, and you could say, okay, well, how would this entire system respond based on all of this data coming in, all of these models, if we implemented a different flow management, a different e-flow scenario, what might happen? And so this is a way that you can actually do these sort of big experiments grounded in reality without actually having to do any sort of modification in the real world. And depending on how well you've built that digital pipeline, that digital twin, you can actually really, really effectively say, this is what I think will happen. The advantage of a digital twin built from machine learning is that it is much more grounded in reality. It's kind of free of some of the assumptions that we make when we build just a pure mathematical simulation. So that's just a quick overview, really, of some of the ideas going from sort of lower to higher complexity. Now, what are sort of the data requirements we need? Now, the needs will vary depending on what sort of model or question you want to answer. You know, not everyone here is going to do machine learning. That is okay. You know, machine learning, data science is actually a very, very deep and nuanced subject. And this was just a quick overview. But all of the CaSTCo partners will be building data sets that could be used for machine learning. So even if you're not planning to do machine learning yourself, it's important to kind of say, what sort of tools would I actually want to be built from these data sets? And so how can I improve our data collection, or how can we look at our data collection to help build them? So really, the main things that determine machine learning are sort of the quality of the data, you know, accuracy, precision, the quantity of the data, both spatially and over time, and the relevance of the data to the specific question that you're asking. Now, data can be quite biased or unevenly distributed based on how it's been sampled. And so that can be addressed with how we actually deploy sensors, how we focus our sampling from our citizen scientists. And then for things like supervised models, we need sort of a ground truth or a label. Say a lot of the examples we've had have looked at sort of pollution events. So ideally, what we need is at least a subset of the data that's coming in to be labeled, where we said, oh, this is one type of pollution event here, this is another here. So, there are questions about how we can best do that. One idea that we've spoken about that's come from this internship is the idea of, can we actually train citizen scientists to be able to do this sort of labeling through something like a Zooniverse project, where a subset of the data could be labeled. That could be used to train an algorithm to label the rest of the data automatically, and then that could be used to train a pollution detection event model. I think the other thing we have to keep in mind is that, for whatever question we're asking, and you can ask anything of machine learning, how do we best represent our question in the data set, either by bringing different data sources together or by sort of manipulating the data to try and show the relationship that we want it to show. Now, I just have a few different little terms at the end here. So data science firms, banks, anyone like that, they will usually employ a cohort of different types of scientists and with different skill sets. For this presentation, I've been asking around as to sort of the definitions and the specific roles of them, and largely that will vary depending on what organization you talk to. So in the end, I got a little bit fed up, and I decided I would ask ChatGPT to come up with a definition in a single sentence for each of them, because honestly, I just appreciated the irony of machine learning classifying the people who do machine learning. So you'll find the data scientists. Now, data scientists are people who will use statistical and computational techniques to analyze large volumes of data and extract insights. Now, largely, you'll find data scientists are people who usually got a PhD in sort of computer science or in physical science. And what their task is about coming up with novel solutions to novel questions, overlaying different sort of data sets and techniques together. Next, you'll have the data engineers, and these are the people who handle the infrastructure of data. They usually have a sort of computer science background, and they sort of are specialized in different coding languages to what data scientists can use. And they will sort of design and develop the infrastructure of data, making sure that it comes in, that it's accessible, and how it can get off to where it needs to go, and also sort of some of the front-end infrastructure. Finally, you'll have the data analysts. Data analysts are usually people they are usually graduates, and they can use sort of statistical visualization tools. And often they will do the data scientists will come up with the novel techniques and solutions, and the data analysts are kind of responsible for implementing that on a wider sort of scale. They do the sort of front end, let's get all these tools running, let's make sure they're all maintained, and let's get that out to the front end to stakeholders and interested parties. Say, for example, a data scientist might come up with an idea about how you could monitor a pollution event, but in reality, that will need to be deployed for every sensor in the network, and usually it would be a data analyst that would take that forward. I thought that is the end of my presentation today. I hope it was accessible to everyone. I've just got a few different links here. There are a lot of really good free machine learning and coding courses you can get on the internet. There are, multiple different cheat sheets. These are just a few examples we have here. And also, if you're interested, there's just very interesting little YouTube channels and websites that have little machine learning stories and can summarize it down quite well to make it very accessible. Were there any questions?
Yes, we did have a question in the chat from Irina. Irina, I don't know if you want to switch on your audio and video and ask that yourself, or?
Yeah, I can do. So I was wondering about your thoughts on predictive accuracy or uncertainty. All kinds of modeling. We'd like it not to be the case, but they're not perfect. And with the machine learning approaches, how can we assess it and effectively communicate it to the people we'd maybe like to use the output, and not immediately jump to the conclusion that, oh yeah, the model said so, therefore it's precise and 100% certain.
So that will vary depending on what type of model that you're actually using, and that's part of the sort of the nuance, particularly with the higher forms of machine learning, where you don't really know what the model is doing, but you have to sort of interrogate it. Say, for example, if you're doing a classification problem, what you'll do is you'll only feed the model a subset of the data to learn from, and you'll hold back a subset of the data, and then you'll test that model on the new data set, and then you'll look at things called you want the precision of the model. So for every time it is predicting a certain class, sort of what proportion of those are correct. You'll want the recall, so of the known models, of the known classes that we know it should be predicting, how many have been properly identified, and then you'll sort of aggregate that into an overall sort of F1 score. Alternatively, so I was doing, as a bit of an aside for the Rivers Trust, I've been doing an analysis sort of looking at how can access to blue and green space influence sort of health across the country. And I was looking at sort of the rate of obesity in different regions. Now, what the models were doing was saying, actually, I think that really high levels of air pollution will make you healthier. And we know logically this is incorrect. That is not what happens. It's a documented phenomenon in the literature. And what was basically happening was that London is an incredibly young and active population with really, really high levels of air pollution. And nothing I could do, no control could kind of account for that. So as part of, we have these tools like cross-validation that we can use to interrogate models to check the accuracy of the recall. And then we can also go deeper, particularly when we're looking at spatial models, and just be like, do I think these relationships kind of make logical sense? And are we seeing sort of any patterns of spatial error in the model? Are we seeing any patterns where, is a model for pollution events, is it being much more effective in winter over summer? So it's about sort of interrogating the predictions and the assumptions the model makes, and the sort of using tools to try and test the accuracy overall, but also just using logic and expert knowledge on the area to sort of try and say, do we think this makes sense? It's kind of data science is part science, part guessing, part sort of magic.
Right. And do you think the cross-validation, I mean, what's not in your training data, your model doesn't know about, right? And it cannot know about it. So I wonder if water quality applications specifically lend themselves to sort of like an iterative ground truthing almost. You find out where your model is poor, and that's where you send your sensors or citizen scientists to ground truth the predictions, I guess.
Yeah, that's one specific one idea that we were discussing as well, particularly for things like phosphate sensors that are quite malfunctioning. It is quite easy to just send a citizen scientist out and get a water sample, particularly if we know it's at different times of the year. Ideally, we'd like to have these ideas before we deploy the sensor networks, but from what I can tell so far, each different catchment is so variable. It will detect such a specific different type. The models don't transfer well between catchments, unfortunately.
Yeah, thank you.
That's a really interesting point as well, because I think where we're starting to see, particularly commercial organizations, companies developing techniques that rely on machine learning to maybe predict difficult to measure parameters from easier to measure ones, the incentive, if you like, for them to deal properly with uncertainty and quality of predictions is maybe not there. And we see quite a lot of some black box kind of measurements, and understanding how, as potential purchasers or subscribers to those systems, we can really understand when they're working well and when they might not be is quite an interesting area.
That's the thing. There's a massive push at the minute too that how do we better make machine learning accessible to people and interpretable? There's a lot of resistance in academia to machine learning because there's this misconception that all machine learning models are not really that interpretable. And the reality is it's only neural nets that you can't really work out what's going on inside. Anything shallow within a neural net, you can usually pick apart what is happening. It just takes a lot more effort. So a lot of my PhD has been focused on actually how can we develop machine learning tools that can support management, where we're trying to make this interpretable to people who aren't necessarily skilled in machine learning. How can we summarize data in the relationships so it can be used? Yeah. Rory has asked, how is the spatial element of data generally represented in a machine learning model? That is a very good question. So basically, it's a whole different thing. One thing I didn't really mention in this presentation is the concept of structure versus unstructured or structured data versus unstructured data. So unstructured data is sort of truly independent data, and it'll be something like an Excel spreadsheet where one row of data won't be related or influence anything else at all. Structured data is where actually the location of each bit of data in the data set is kind of important. So the way you can kind of conceptualize this is sort of like time series data, where the value you get at one row of data will be dependent on the values you've had before it and the values you've had after it. And also something like a satellite image is structured data, where actually, each individual pixel, if it's just RGB, red, green, and blue photo image, that's actually each pixel is 3 variables, the red value, the green, and the blue. And then actually it's the relationship, the location of that pixel in each one that determines the model overall. Spatial data is much the same. If you've got even sampling across a map, then effectively it is that structured data where sort of everything is related to each other. If you've got uneven sampling like we have in the sensor network, it's still structured, it's a bit more complicated. So it's basically just a really different tool set. It's different models that have to learn that structure. So it's models like a convolutional neural net or a graph neural net, or simpler models like, Moran's eye, where actually they are able to look at the value of each pixel, but also the value of pixels around it to answer the question. Say, for example, in the graph neural net that we're doing for the data study group, I've told it the specific watercourse distances between all sensors. So the model will say like, okay, look, I want to predict the value of a variable here, and I know the distance to these sensors upstream, so it's going to give more weighting to the sensors upstream. The great bit about a graph neural net is it will work out the weightings itself. With something like a univariate Moran's eye, you can specify specifically what sort of weighting you want to give to the variables around it. Is it just a simple straight line? Should I just have nice little asymptotic decline, stuff like that? Now, there is a bit of nuance here. Like, the trouble with spatial analysis is that you can kind of make it show anything you want if you're specifying the spatial relationship yourself. So you have to be really, really careful about how you choose those weightings. And that's why I tend to prefer things like neural nets for that, where I'm not picking it myself. It's not subject to my bias. It will just learn from the data. Were there any other questions?
Interesting, thank you, Andrew. I've got a couple of questions. One was, so if there are people out there listening or not who are collecting time series data with multi-parameter sensors, that's been available and people have been doing that for years and years. Have you got any kind of suggestions or tips on how they can make that data kind of machine learning ready, ready for someone like you or your successors to pick up in the future and answer questions that they might have but are unable to get at?
Yeah, I think it ties back to the point I was trying to make for the data requirement slide. What question would you guys as experts want answered? What tools would you like developed? And then think about sort of how can you represent that in the data? Time series analysis is really good at sort of picking up relationships, the sort of the shape of a curve. But if you want to detect a pollution event, ideally you'll need to have labeled that pollution event. You'll need to say which time series points are actually representing what you want it to look at. On top of that, we, as part of what a data scientist will do, we are quite good at handling noisy data, at tidying data, and the specifics of how we do that, we can worry about that sort of thing. There's so much nuance and stress there. I think the point I'd like to make too is that, a lot of people have this idea that machine learning is here to sort of replace expert opinion, but it is entirely not. A data scientist will be good at the algorithms and data, but they don't know the specific nuance, the specific complexities of each individual field. So it's basically just about trying to work with the data scientist to say, what I want to look like? What are the usual signals I should look for? What are the important variables? And how can I label this data in a way that we can use for machine learning?
And that would be as simple as essentially if your data's in a spreadsheet, adding another column where there's a comment saying, we think this event was agricultural pollution or a sewage spill or whatever.
Yeah, and if you
Cool.
could just use consistent labels, that would be lovely.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
there's a lot of stuff in sort of the biosis data set where you've got spelling errors on species. So the same species might be represented 5 times. And if people could avoid that, it would make life a lot easier for people.
Yeah. Yeah, that was something. There was a water industry event on machine learning a couple of months ago, and they said that was a massive problem. The number of different ways people could spell flood or flow was a real problem in terms of getting those data sets that are existing into the kind of the system. I think there's one other thing I'd like to say, and if there's no other questions, when we first got in touch with you and you started with us, there was a whole myriad of different applications of machine learning to what we're doing around river and water quality monitoring, citizen science data sets that we could have pointed you at. And what I'd be really keen for people watching and their friends and neighbours to feed into us, myself and Michelle at the Rivers Trust and Andrew, is what problems do you have with kind of getting information out of your data that you think maybe machine learning might have a role in? Because what we need to do is move on from pick up where Andrew's left off, and hopefully we'll be working with him again in the future. But if in the meantime kind of start collating those kind of case studies where we can start pointing machine learning applications at different problems.
I should say there is no stupid idea for that. You can ask basically any question of machine learning so long as you have the data to represent it. One idea that is being explored is the idea of, can we do sort of photo recognition of invertebrates via like a phone camera? They've got tools for that to do it with sort of marine algae and invertebrates, and actually that could be a tool that would help citizen scientists quite a lot. But then the questions are sort of, okay, we have this question, what data do we need? How do we build those data sets? And so on.
Yes, thank you. I just see a comment from Charlotte Hawkins there. You see that one, Andrew?
Yep.
Chat. So only the EA data sets in the data study group?
What do you mean?
I mean, that was a question for Andrew, whether I know we've spoken, Andrew's spoken to Matt Lowenthal and the team at wherever they are now, Caversham. But I know that most of their sensors are deployed upstream and downstream of a source or suspected source. Yes.
Yeah, Andrew has been using that data set to do the initial kind of bit of the study, I think, haven't you, Andrew?
So yeah, now from what I can tell from a lot of the Environment Agency water quality sensors, often they seem to be deployed quite reactively and sort of as an investigative thing. So they're usually only actually in the water for like 2 to 3 months. And the issue with that is that a lot of these models kind of require a bit longer time series, a bit more information to be able to sort of train. So, there are probably questions that can be deployed that can be asked if you're looking at the entirety of these water quality network things together, but they were kind of beyond the scope of what I've been doing for this. Say, for example, if you could bring all of those like 2-month sensors together into a single data frame, and then you could start to try and get an understanding of actually what sort of patterns should I expect from water quality sensors based on where they are. The goal here is that you don't really want, or like it's not going to be the most efficient if you have to do a specific model for each individual sensor. So a much more ambitious goal might be to try and work out, based off historical sensor, every sensor we've ever deployed in the UK, can we sort of learn some of the rules to help new sensor networks? This is something called semi-supervised machine learning, which is trying to recreate how we as humans learn. But I have not had access to the computational power necessary to do it, the data sets necessary to do it, and it would probably, those models take like 2 months at a time to fit. So I would have just wasted the internship. But the idea would be you've kind of got this rough understanding of what you would expect based on different river conditions, and you deploy a new sensor, and it's kind of like, okay, I know roughly what should happen. What are the specifics for this sensor, though? Which is a quite cool concept.
Cool. That's, yeah, I mean, so Michelle's saying that the EA sensor datasets are soon to be published as an open API, so that would be interesting. But also, I think if there's any specific, sensor locations where there's long-term datasets or anything, just let us know, because we'll be very interested to pick up on that.
I think the other thing I was kind of looking at is that we were looking more at sensor networks. So I was primarily trying to find places where we had multiple sensors deployed for a long period in a single catchment. So there were some that I was initially thinking about, like the one at Ilkley, but it was just one sensor alone, which couldn't answer some of the network questions we wanted to get at.
Slightly different set of questions and yeah, okay. Right, well, we're up to time. So looks like Charlotte's typing, but so perhaps we will. Charlotte,
we can continue the discussion on the Slack channels is what I was going to suggest. But yeah, thank you very much, Andrew. I think that was really good. And I think, this just helps kind of improve us as clients of possible machine learning. I'm certainly not going to be dabbling myself. I think it's over my head, but I think it's really important to understand more about this technology. It's going to become really important going forward, with the requirements in the Environment Act for real-time sensor networks. We're going to see, a tidal wave of data. So yeah, thank you very much. And please do join in the chat on the Slack channels and we'll share all the links with you.
Thank you very much, everyone. Bye.